So right now, a lot is happening inside Russia. For one, Putin's war economy is continuing to cause Russia's oil industry to crack. Not because Russia's running out of oil, but because it's running out of profitable oil. And so this time it's not because of, say, rhetoric or bravado, but because simply the numbers just don't work. You see, Russian crude is now selling at pandemic-era prices. Some cargoes are being discounted so heavily that they are effectively priced below $30 a barrel. And so for a country that still runs on oil revenue, the most infamous of petrostates, this isn't a temporary inconvenience. It's a structural problem. Simultaneously, Russia's central bank has quietly cut interest rates again, even as inflation remains stubbornly sticky, above target, and all while economic growth slows sharply. Now, when taken in isolation, these things may not seem all that important, but you have to look at them collectively, not just the trade policy, not just the fiscal policy, not just the monetary policy, but how all of them combined depict a very different and unpleasant picture from the Kremlin. So in this video, I wanted to explain what's happening inside Russia's oil sector specifically, why American sanctions are biting far harder than we thought they were, and how this is blowing a hole in the federal budget, in monetary options, and why Moscow is stuck between inflation, stagnation, and no easy way out for this economic hardship. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you are new here, well, we look at a combination of geopolitics, economics, and international relations, with a particular focus often on the Russia-Ukraine war, but not just the military aspect, also the sanctions, the diplomacy, and the long-term sustainability of this conflict. And this story right today sits at the intersection of all three of those, because right now there is an uncomfortable truth for those in Moscow. Russia is facing its biggest problem not because of sanctions alone or the war itself, but because its entire economic, as we've often discussed on this channel, depends on an unsustainable set of factors. On oil prices, for one, that no longer exist. But before continuing, of course, what do you think? I welcome your thoughts. Is this the beginning of a new phase, or is it something that is being blown out of proportion by those with a particular agenda? Let me know in the comments below, and let's have a debate about it. Now, of the components that I wanted to start with, it's going to be oil, because oil is still the backbone of the Russian state. Over the past few weeks, as we've covered a lot on the channel, prices for Russia's flagship, what's known as Urals crude, have collapsed to their lowest levels since the pandemic, since 2020. According to pricing data, the Urals have been selling abroad for roughly $34 to $36 per barrel, with discounts of more than $20 versus, say, Brent. Now, in some cases, especially cargoes destined for specific refiners, say the Chinese, discounts have reportedly reached around $35. That effectively prices Russia's oil below $30 when you take into account all the parameters. Now, this matters because at around $40 per barrel, Urals crude barely covers extraction and transportation costs. Indeed, aside from all these numbers, basically it means that anything below that level means producers are no longer earning real profits. They're simply just trying to sustain themselves and keep the wells running to avoid permanent damage. Sources that I've spoken to and inside Russian oil companies say that producers are already struggling to cover capital expenditure across several fields. Remote projects with high production costs, likely already operating at losses. Compare that to, say, older, more mature deposits in Western Siberia and the Volga region. They do hold up better. You see, they benefit from lower operating costs, large overall reserves, and proximity to pipelines. But even there, the margins are shrinking fast, if already non-existent, and therefore upstream oil industry is sliding into a degree of permacrisis. All of this revealing one other major component, which is economic geography. As some of you may have seen in a recent interview I had with the Financial Times' Martin Wolf, the role of geography in economics cannot be understated. Russia is a vast country, and while Putin and his cronies like to emphasize that and why it makes it great, unless you leverage that effectively, you have the infrastructure and means by which to utilize all the resources that you have, doesn't lead to much. If anything, it's actually a detriment. Russia has abundancy in raw commodities, oil, and so on, but Putin is spending so much of his money and resources into a pointless war that he's not actually focusing on upscaling his own country, its own development, which ultimately would mean Russia is much more prosperous further down the line. Considering that aspect, of course, these deteriorations are also not happening in a vacuum. Immediate triggers a new round of US sanctions, targeting major Russian producers, which have severely disrupted established export routes to the key players we've mentioned in previous videos, India, China. Indian refiners, in particular, are increasingly refusing Russian cargoes, not because the oil is insufficiently cheap, but because this sanctions risk is becoming just too damn high. As a result, Russia is being forced to slash prices simply just to move the oil. Some estimates that there is between 1.6 and 2.8 million barrels per day of Russian oil that could end up just stranded without any firm demand. So the oil still exists, it can still be pumped, but it is not easily sold. And much of this is now just being stored offshore in tankers, floating at sea while Moscow scrambles to find buyers willing to take that risk. This is just simply not sustainable. Storage capacities fill up and discounts deepen. Revenues therefore fall further, and there are only so many buyers left with both the appetite but also the ability to absorb sanctioned oil at scale. Then we come to the corporate side. The financial damage is already visible in company results. Net profits at Rosneft fell threefold over the first 9 months of this year. Gazprom's NES profits dropped nearly 40%, and Lukoil lost roughly half of its first half earnings and now faces growing risks to its foreign assets in their entirety. Dividend payments across the sector are expected to be the lowest in 5 years. And for the Kremlin, therefore, this is not an economic or corporate economic problem. Oil companies are a pillar of the political economy because of the way Putin structured it. They fund the state, they support regional budgets, and they help maintain social stability. Some producers are now questioning whether it even makes sense to raise output under existing production agreements when prices are this low and cash flows are turning negative. Russia still can pump that oil, but increasingly unable to sell it at all, let alone at a profit. So, from the trade policy, if you like, to now the fiscal policy or the federal budget. Oil and gas revenues, which fund everything from pensions to regional subsidies to military expenditure, have, and I don't use this word lightly, collapsed. In December, energy revenues fell to around 410 billion rubles, nearly 50% lower than this time last year. That is the weakest performance since the pandemic, since 2020. And Russia's 2025 budget was originally drafted assuming oil prices would be close to $70 per barrel. That assumption has already been cut sharply, along with projected revenues. Even under the downgraded forecasts, some believe the budget may still fall short by hundreds of billions of rubles. So when federal finances, regional budgets, and social funds are combined, Russia's total fiscal deficit could reach roughly 4% of GDP. Again, that's the highest since the pandemic, a one-in-a-lifetime event, some people argue. So this is the central contradiction of Russia's war economy. Military spending remains elevated, but the revenue base supporting it is eroding, if not largely dissipated completely. Now, quick pause here, because all this matters. And in the next video, I'm going to be looking at Ukraine's operations against Russia's so-called shadow fleet, how those maritime disruptions are tightening the screws on Russia's oil exports even further, and why this is becoming one of the most under-discussed but increasingly crucial pressure points in the whole conflict. So if you want to understand how these, say, budget numbers or oil prices connect directly to what's being done at sea by Ukraine or some parts of the European allies, make sure you're subscribed. It's going to be a really good one. So now we've looked at trade policy, fiscal policy. What about monetary policy? Well, here the squeeze tightens even further. You see, Russia's central bank has cut its key interest rate to 16%, marking the 5th consecutive reduction just this year. But that headline, while juicy in itself, masks how constrained policymakers really are. Rates have been pushed to more than 20% last year to contain inflation driven largely by heavy state and military spending. Inflation remains close to 6%, well above the target, and the central bank has repeatedly signalled that it intends to keep policy tight for an extended period, without really defining what that extended period is. So simultaneously, though, economic growth also fades. And after strong headline growth over the past year, GDP is expected to expand by only 0.5% to 1%, if that. This means that businesses are now warning about high borrowing costs, weak demand, and an overvalued ruble, which are all creating this perfect storm that discourages further investment. Markets which had hoped for, say, bolder rate cuts instead are disappointed by the modest moves and reinforced sense that inflation is outstripping growth. With that dilemma becoming clear, though, you are in a catch-22. You cut rates too quickly, and inflationary pressure surges again. But if you keep rates too high, well, the economy stagnates. Talk about the definition of between a rock and a hard place. So put this all together, and the picture becomes incredibly clear. Russia isn't running out of oil. It's running out of that profitable oil, compounded by the sanctions, which are not going to collapse production overnight, but are hollowing out the margins, discouraging the investment, draining the budget, and forcing increasingly painful trade-offs, not just within the government, but within the private sector. It's not a dramatic crash. It's a slow-burning fiscal monetary squeeze, and those are often the worst kinds you can imagine. Russia can endure low prices for a period. It's done this many times, and Russians are used to living tough. But it just numbers and the maths mean that they cannot sustain a high-spending war economic style indefinitely, especially when oil revenues are reaching pandemic unique levels. The system still functions, but it's functioning under strain, and that strain is no longer theoretical. So if current conditions persist, the pressure does not ease. It compounds. The core message of this video I want you to take away. If oil prices remain low and discounts stay wide, Russian producers will be forced to make choices they have so far delayed, cutting investment, mothballing higher cost fields, or leaning even harder on the state support, which for the Kremlin means even fewer options. They can raise taxes on oil companies, but that risks accelerating production decline. It can borrow more, but at higher interest rates and with limited access to foreign capital, that's not wise. Or it can, of course, dip further into revenues, which, well, it does buy time, but not sustainability, and there's only so much of your reserves you can eat into. So the right path right now is probably boring, but muddling through, trying to manage this increasingly challenge of inflationary pressure with short-term fixes rather than long-term planning. And that's precisely when slow burn, economic stress becomes politically dangerous, and for Putin, the worst of all. But that's it from me, everyone. Thanks for watching, and do subscribe if you want to see the future video and upcoming ones. Don't forget to ring the bell. My name is Pyotr Kurzin. I'm a mix of Russian and English, and I try to bring that through the videos that I discuss here. And if you want to support me further, then do consider checking out the links below where you can buy me a coffee, or checking out my Substack, where I'm going to be producing more content, more deeper dives, based on sometimes the videos that I produce, but things that you might not see me cover here on the channel. Thanks a lot, and happy Christmas if we don't see you before then. Take care.